It's been nearly 15 years since the PSP was released, and yet I still find myself going back to the little handheld every once and a while. I recently bought a second PSP, one that I would feel more comfortable with bringing and maybe getting a little bit more beat up than the one that I grew up with, which I want to keep in ideally really good condition. So I purchased another PSP through eBay and discovered a very cheap way to get your hands on a PSP in 2019 without having to go to a pawn shop or a flea market and get lucky with a deal. This is something that you can get a great price on right now just by simply going over and clicking some of the links I'm going to have down in the description. I'm going to explain to you how I got what I feel like is a really good deal on a great handheld. Now keep in mind the fact that PSP games can be emulated pretty well through most modern phones, which means the actual necessity to own a PSP to play the great games in its library is actually kind of obsolete. Now, I personally prefer to play these games with the physical hardware and the physical buttons, and I feel like playing a game kind of as complicated as a PSP game with as many on-screen controls as a PSP game has is very difficult on, even a 6-inch touchscreen in my opinion. So I had heard through Reddit that the cheapest way to buy a PSP is actually to buy a Japanese model, which is what I ended up doing. This is the model that I got off of eBay. I paid, I want to say, about $26 with shipping to get this one shipped to me from Japan, and the fact that it's from Japan actually doesn't really matter. I was able to install custom firmware on this, which is very easy on the PSP. I will have a link to a website that will help walk you through doing that if you've never done it before. And in doing so, I was able to actually reverse the X and O preset buttons. In Japan, the main button that you use to click on stuff is O, and the button used to go back is X, whereas in the US, that's reversed. By installing the CFW, the custom firmware, I was actually able to set that main click button as X and the back button as O, like I would typically have on an American model, as well as being able to obviously change the settings of the language to English so that this operates completely like a typical American PSP now that the CFW is on it. In fact, the eBay seller that I used, who I'll have linked in the description, was actually kind enough to already have this set to English when it arrived in the mail. Now, a few more things I want to point out about these. Many of them that are sold by Japan for you, that's the seller that I used, who's not endorsing this video in any way, but they do sell so many PSPs. Many of theirs do not come with a battery cover or a battery. That's really not a big deal because if you get a battery that's 15 years old like this, it probably isn't going to hold much of a charge anyways. So you really are going to want to buy a new battery, and we'll get into the extra things you'll need to buy here in a little bit. My hope is that you can get this thing completely set up for less than $50. Now, the other thing I want to point out is the charging cable. There's a USB port on the top. It's the same, I believe that is a mini USB port. The same one that would be used by a PS3 controller is located on the top. You can charge the console through that if you have custom firmware. Otherwise, you'll need a specific PSP charger that would plug into the bottom. However, I feel like most people probably don't have a PSP charger randomly laying around, but they may have that mini USB charger. So if you already have one of those, you won't have to worry about finding one. And that's going to be something that I'm going to leave out of including in the price in this video. With that squared away, I can show you how I found the correct PSP for me, which was one that covered all the bases, worked, and had a few dots on the screen. I don't even really notice the dots or the individual pixels that may be out on the screen. I think that if you bought one of these at a swapper's meet or a flea market or something like that, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find one that didn't have any pixels out on the screen. When I'm looking at each one of these that are being sold by Japan for you, they do a very good job of giving a description of what's actually wrong with the console. This could be anything from a button not actually working to, just being lines or a dot on the screen, or maybe the UMD drive doesn't work, which you shouldn't be using anymore because the UMD drive is very slow to load in comparison to the SD card. If you're loading games digitally, it is much faster and definitely the preferred way to play any games on a PSP yet. So when you're looking through these, trying to decide which is going to be the best option for you, for one, I recommend only the PSP 1000 or PSP 2000 models. Now, if you're going to be doing any emulation playing, heavy emulation playing like a Nintendo 64 game, which you can play through the custom firmware on a PSP, I do not recommend the 1000 model as it struggles to play the Nintendo 64 games due to its reduced RAM. Now, both obviously the 1000 and the 2000 models can play PSP games just fine, but if you want to play, some of the higher powered emulators like the Nintendo 64, you're not going to be able to do that very well on the 1000 models, so you're going to want to get a 2000 model. Now, if you're not concerned about playing, say, Nintendo 64 emulators, you could get by a little bit cheaper by getting a 1000 model, which are the ones that are available in much higher frequencies on here as well. So I'm just taking a look at each of these, sorting by price of cheapest to highest, and just looking at what is broken with them. If you find one that maybe it's got a couple dots on the screen, the UMD drive doesn't work, I think that is one that would treat you very well because, like I said, there's really no reason to be playing UMDs anymore, and the couple dots on the screen is not going to be a big issue. What you want to definitely avoid is ones where critical buttons like maybe circle or X are completely not working, or even the triggers. If the triggers aren't working, that's going to make it be very difficult to play a lot of games. So I would highly recommend you stay away from any of the ones where the buttons are not working unless you are able to fix those or believe you're able to fix those. Then I also bought a 32 gigabyte SD card, which I'm going to put into the SD card adapter that I got for the memory stick. I think 32 gigs is a pretty good amount for the PSP. I know some people do insane amounts like 128 gigs, stuff like that. The XMB does load slower on the 32 gigs compared to, like, say, my 4 gigs. And I'm sure if I went up to 128, the XMB would load even slower. And by the XMB, I mean the main menu when I'm trying to pick a game. It takes a little bit of time to think about, what games are actually stored on the SD card before it loads up that list for me, just because it has so much content to pull up. So I think that 32 gigs gives you, I would say probably 20 to 25 games, which is already a lot to play, packed into one handheld without, really sacrificing all too much load time. Now, the last thing you're going to want to buy is a battery. The specific battery I bought will be linked down in the description, though this is a PSP 2000 and 3000 battery. Notice we have not talked at all about the PSP 3000. It's a more expensive model typically, and one that I wouldn't recommend because the improvements that it has I don't think are substantial enough in the used game market to make it be worthwhile. But regardless, this is the battery for the 2000 and the 3000 models. And it also comes with the battery cover, which you will need, and the screen protector, which I recommend putting on even if the screen already has some damage to it. I think it's always nice to at least preserve the condition that it's in. So it's, the screen protector is free included in this, so I figured why not put it on mine as well. So between the SD card, the adapter, and the battery with the back end battery cover, you're looking at less than $20 for those parts. As long as you can buy the console for less than $30, you're in good shape and you're able to get yourself set up for less than $50, which I think is a much better deal than trying to scrounge around looking for a pawn shop or a flea market where you can find one of these for, maybe 60, 70, 80 bucks with a battery that's probably shot or maybe no battery at all. Whereas here you can get yourself some new stuff, a new memory card, a new battery in this used console, which for some reason in playing my Japan model versus playing my 2000 US model, they're both 2000s, they're both silver. For some reason, I think that the screen on the Japan model looks better. I've tried to look into that to see if the screens were different, but from what I can tell, they should be the same screen, so maybe it's just something all in my head. But if you guys have any questions about this, how I put this thing together for less than $50, and I'm really enjoying it, drop them down in the comments section and I'll do my best to get back to you. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bailey and I will see you in the next video.